The Telepathy Tapes and Facilitated Communication, IZARD, exploring facilitator queuing in a no-touch form of FC. Welcome to another critique of facilitated communication.
Why is it that most of the time, most of the autistic individuals are not looking at the keyboard?
Just a heads up to my regular viewers. First, thank you for your support, I appreciate it. Based on the comments I'm getting from those new to the channel and/or from proponents, I've repeated some information about authorship, FC, and facilitator queuing in this video. I've put timestamps in the description box below this video if you'd like to skip around. Goals of this video: to review the two main categories of facilitated communication, to identify the types and characteristics of the forms of FC used by participants featured in the Telepathy Tapes podcast, to explore facilitator behaviors during a no-touch FC session, IZARD. Observations from a former facilitator. What follows are my observations as a former facilitator who, unlike 100% of the current-day facilitators, participated in reliably controlled authorship testing in 1993, just 3 years after FC was introduced to the U.S. by Douglas Bicklin of Syracuse University. Before I get to the critique, I'd like to take a moment to share some things I learned about FC after the testing. These are things workshop leaders failed to tell us in the training. What FC workshop leaders didn't tell us. FC was not then, and is not now, an evidence-based technique. Anecdotes and testimonials, aka feel-good miracle stories, are not evidence, though facilitators may sincerely believe in the technique. Reliably controlled tests consistently show that the FC-generated responses are only correct when the facilitators have access to the test stimuli. Question: if the communications are independent, why does the facilitator have to know the answers for it to quote-unquote work? When facilitators are blinded from test stimuli, the FC-generated responses are either incorrect, the clients can't spell; unintelligible, the clients don't have letter sound recognition; or correctly spelled with words that have nothing to do with the questions being asked. In other words, facilitator guesses. Most facilitators are unaware of the extent to which they use physical, visual, and/or auditory cues to influence and control letter selection. Well-intentioned people can be fooled by FC. I stopped using FC after the testing in 1993, but I've continued studying it over the past 30-plus years. I've also been waiting for proponents to conduct reliably controlled studies that address facilitator queuing and prove communication independence with these techniques. I am, and the world is, still waiting. Today's facilitators are taught not to participate in reliably controlled studies designed to separate facilitator behaviors from those of their clients or loved ones. Some facilitators claim it's unethical to test for authorship, but even without the reliably controlled testing, we can learn a great deal about facilitator behaviors through pro-FC movies, YouTube videos, and other media. The Telepathy Tapes. The Telepathy Tapes podcast is currently drawing a lot of attention in the United States for its claims that non-speaking individuals with autism have telepathic abilities. The presenter of the podcast, Kai Dickens, and the experts featured in the podcast, however, downplay the fact that the autistic individuals featured in the podcast are being subjected to a discredited technique known as facilitated communication. Proponents of FC have yet to provide reliably controlled evidence that the technique leads to communication independence for the individuals being subjected to its use. In fact, the evidence shows that facilitators are often inadvertently controlling letter selection. To date, facilitator authorship and FC-generated messages have only been ruled in, not ruled out, when tests have been conducted under reliably controlled conditions that blind facilitators from test stimuli. In the telepathy tapes, the participants, not the facilitators, were denied access to the pictures, words, and numbers being spelled out using FC. In each test, the facilitators knew the answers to the spelled responses. Promoters of the telepathy tapes seem confused about what constitutes facilitated communication, a technique that was discredited in the United States by 1995. Facilitator-dependent techniques. Facilitated communication, or FC, is an umbrella term that represents all facilitator-dependent techniques, regardless of whether the facilitator holds onto the client or holds onto the letterboard. Over the years, FC has evolved into two main categories, touch-based and no-touch forms of FC. Two main categories of facilitated communication. Touch-based. The facilitator supports the child by holding onto his wrist, forearm, elbow, shoulder, or other body part during letter selection. It's known as supported typing, saved by typing, assisted typing, hand over hand, letterboarding, and others. Minimal or no-touch FC. The facilitator holds a letterboard or stencil in the air while the child extends a finger toward it. Sometimes, but rarely, the child holds onto the keyboard or letterboard, but the facilitator uses visual or auditory cues to aid in letter selection. It's known as rapid prompting method, spelling to communicate, speller's method, informative pointing, spelling with eyes, and others. Role of facilitators or communication regulation partners. Facilitator role in touch-based FC. Proponent view. Provide physical and emotional support. Steady the motor movements of the individual. Redirect the individual's attention if necessary. Fade support from wrist to shoulder. Presume competence. And don't test. Skeptic view. Facilitators often unwittingly cue their clients in ways that not only influence, but control letter selection. Fading support from wrist to shoulder does not eliminate facilitator influence over letter selection. Authorship can be tested by controlling the information the facilitator sees during testing. Facilitator role in no-touch forms of FC. Proponent view. Communication difficulties in autistic individuals are primarily due to motor difficulties and require their support. Cueing cannot occur if the facilitator doesn't touch their client. There is a mind-to-mind bond between facilitator and child. Skeptic view. Many autistic individuals perform gross and fine motor activities independently and without facilitator interference, so why can't they select letters on a keyboard by themselves? Facilitators, however unwittingly, can cue their clients even when the board is being held in the air with minimal physical touch. FC conversations are one-sided and facilitator-controlled. For more detailed information about FC and all its variant forms, please visit facilitatedcommunication.org or FC is Not Science, my YouTube channel. FC and telepathy. Promoters of the telepathy tapes want us to believe that non-speaking autistic individuals being subjected to FC, S2C, and RPM have telepathic abilities. This is quite an extraordinary claim, but does FC work? Does telepathy exist? Proponent view. FC works because people using FC say it works. Telepathy works because facilitators and parents feel like it works. People who question these beliefs are against people with disabilities. Skeptic view. All reliably controlled tests of authorship to date demonstrate that the facilitator, not the individual being subjected to FC, are controlling the messages. Telepathy testing in FC cannot be determined until authorship is established. Testing for facilitator cues. The key to proving FC authorship and telepathic abilities is to determine whether the spelled responses can be attributed to the autistic individual without external cues from the facilitators. This is most reliably done through carefully controlled message passing tests that are designed to separate facilitator behaviors from those of the individual being subjected to FC. Main categories of facilitator cueing. Physical. Touches by the facilitator on the client's wrist, elbow, shoulder, or other body part. Even slight changes in pressure can influence letter selection. Visual. Movements from the facilitator like head nods, hand signals, and shifts in body weight can signal the client where on the letterboard to touch. Often these movements are inadvertent, but not always. Verbal or auditory. Spoken utterances that signal to the client where on the letterboard to touch, like when the facilitator says the sound of the target letter before the individual touches the board. It should be noted that facilitators may or may not be fully aware of the extent to which these cues influence and control letter selection. Facilitators are even taught in some workshops to prompt their hearts out. Purpose of cueing. Proponent view. To physically and emotionally support the client. To help regulate his or her movements. To help correct and or prevent repetitive or self-stimming behaviors. Skeptic view. FC doesn't work without facilitator cues. Individuals are essentially taught to point on cue through repetition and reinforcement of the desired behavior, like pointing a finger toward a letterboard. Any cues by the facilitators should be faded within days, not weeks or years, after teaching a client a new skill. A telepathy test, IZARD. In today's example, a young man sits beside his mother on a couch. The mother acts as a facilitator as he is tasked with spelling out a random word, IZARD, that he has not seen, but that his mother has. The facilitator is using a no-touch form of FC, and though her son holds the iPad, she maintains eye contact with the letterboard and moves her hand and body in a way that raises questions about authorship. The original clip was 39 seconds long. I've pared it down to 16 seconds. First, I will show an unedited version of the clip. Then we'll annotate it to draw attention to the facilitator's behaviors. To some people, it looks like the young man is selecting letters on the iPad independently because his mother is not touching him. But as I mentioned earlier, facilitators can cue their clients without physical touch. Let's look at an annotated version of the clip with a focus on the facilitator's behaviors. Besides the hand movements, note how she maintains constant eye contact with her son's iPad. This is a hallmark of FC. Now let's look at their hand movements. They look synchronized to me. This type of visual cueing comes from many hours of practice. I've added a mask to focus your attention on their hands. Was this a reliably controlled test for telepathy? Proponent view. Yes, the young man correctly spelled a randomly generated word that he had not seen, but that his mother had. His mother did not touch him during letter selection. Skeptic view. No. Telepathic abilities in individuals being subjected to FCS2C and RPM can't be tested until authorship is established. This test did not rule out facilitator influence and control over letter selection. Was the spelled response independently produced? Proponent view. Yes, the young man spelled the word independently without much physical touch. There was one point in the video where it looked like she might have touched him, but it could have been the camera angle. Skeptic view. No, the facilitator exhibited behaviors, moving her hands and body, that raised questions about authorship. The FC-generated responses cannot be considered independent unless the external behaviors of the facilitator can be ruled out. I've been asked whether I think the facilitators featured in the telepathy tapes are deliberately cheating. At this point, I have no reason to believe that these parents are anything but sincere in their belief regarding FC and possibly telepathy. Although this facilitator, as we've seen in other clips of her, seems to have some awareness that cueing can occur in others and that it can influence letter selection, she doesn't seem to understand that she herself could be influencing her son's letter selection. However, because the facilitator is probably just following the FC guidelines she was taught during training, the facilitator may not be aware of the full extent to which physical, visual, and auditory cues can influence and control letter selection, even if she doesn't intend to do so. Facilitators are taught not to test for competence, aka FC authorship, so it's likely that the facilitator in this example has not participated in reliably controlled testing to rule in or rule out her own behaviors during the spelling activities. I think that's why I get so frustrated with the so-called experts featured in the telepathy tapes. They're the ones who should be guiding these parents to seek help from professionals trained in evidence-based communication techniques and legitimate augmentative and alternative communication, not stringing them along with the false promises of pseudoscience. FC was discredited over 30 years ago. Summary. The Telepathy Tapes is a popular podcast claiming that non-speaking individuals with autism have telepathic abilities. The producers of the podcast failed to inform the listeners that the individuals featured in the testing are being subjected to a discredited communication technique called facilitated communication. There are two main categories for FC, touch-based and minimal or no touch. Regardless of which form of FC the spellers in the podcast are being subjected to, there's no reliably controlled testing to prove proponent claims of independent communication among its users. Rather, facilitators, not those being subjected to FC, are likely the authors of FC-generated messages. Facilitators, though well-meaning, are often unaware of the extent to which they control letter selection through physical, visual, and auditory cueing. Anecdotes and testimonials, though interesting and often where scientific inquiry begins, are not evidence. In today's example of a telepathy test, the facilitator used a no-touch form of FC. However, she maintained constant eye contact with the letterboard and moved her hands and body around during letter selection. This raises questions about authorship in the spelling session. For this to be a reliably controlled test for FC authorship or for telepathy, the facilitator would need to be reliably blinded from the test stimuli and all external cues eliminated. This telepathy test raises more questions than it answers. Here are a few questions off the top of my head. Put your questions in the comments below this video if you can think of others regarding FC, telepathy, or this test. Questions. What would happen to the accuracy of the spelled responses if the facilitator was not able to see the test stimuli, the word or the number, ahead of time? The facilitator was not allowed to see the letterboard during letter selection. The facilitator was not allowed to speak or to move her hands or body during letter selection. The facilitator was out of visual and auditory range during letter selection. The young man was allowed to interact with the iPad without interference from the facilitator. The young man was shown one word and his mother was shown a different word. Which word would he spell, his or his mother's word? The science. To date, there's no scientifically rigorous evidence to prove facilitated communication, spelling to communicate, rapid prompting method, or any of their variants produce independent communication. Controlled studies show that facilitators, not their clients, are producing the typed messages. Many organizations oppose the use of facilitator-reliant techniques. These include, but are not limited to, American Speech-Language Hearing Association, American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, American Psychological Association, Association for Behavior Analysis, Association for Science in Autism Treatment. These organizations cite the following reasons. They encourage their members not to use facilitator-reliant techniques: lack of scientific evidence, prompt dependency, facilitator cueing and control over letter selection, potential harms including false allegations of abuse, lost opportunity costs as individuals are prevented access to evidence-based forms of augmentative and alternative communication. This educational video is intended to draw attention to the problem of facilitated cueing in a technique called facilitated communication. Criticisms of FC, S2C, and RPM, or any of their variants contained in this video, are not directed at the individuals being subjected to its use. For more information about FC, please visit facilitatedcommunication.org. Please subscribe, like, share, and comment to help grow this project. Thank you for watching until the very end, and remember, FC is not science.